The rain did not just fall. It punished the glass. Sheets of gray water hammered against the panoramic windows of the Daily Chronicle's corner office, blurring the city lights of Seattle into a smear of neon bleeding into the dark. Inside, the rhythmic thrum of the storm was the only sound, save for the ticking of a wall clock that seemed to amplify the silence between two people who were about to make a decision that could end a life. Mark bounded from his leather chair, the leather creaking in protest, and paced the length of the small room. He looked older tonight. The fluorescent hum of the newsroom lights outside the glass partition cast deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. He stopped at the window, staring out at the deluge, his reflection ghostly against the black sky. "You're not just crossing a line, Sarah," Mark said, his voice low, gravelly with exhaustion and the lingering smoke of a habit he'd quit 3 years ago. "You are erasing it. You are stepping off the edge of the map." Sarah Bennett sat perfectly still on the other side of the mahogany desk. In the dim light, she looked less like the tenacious investigative journalist who had toppled city councilmen and exposed corrupt pharmaceutical giants, and more like a statue carved from resolve. Her hands were folded over a thick, manila folder that sat in the center of the desk, an object that seemed to possess its own gravitational pull. "The map is already wrong, Mark," Sarah replied, her tone steady, betraying none of the adrenaline that was currently spiking her heart rate. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough paper of the file. "We pretend the world works a certain way. We pretend that when the vulnerable vanish, they just slip through the cracks. But cracks don't have locks. Cracks don't have electric fences. And cracks certainly don't receive $10 million in black-budget government grants annually." Mark turned, his eyes flashing. "This isn't a conspiracy theory forum. This is Blackwood. This is a fortress built on a mountain that God forgot. It's been there for 60 years. If there were skeletons in those closets, they would have rattled by now." "They are rattling," Sarah countered, flipping the folder open. "You just have to listen to the frequency." She spread the photographs out across the desk. They were grainy, high-contrast black and white images, mugshots taken from police databases and missing person reports. They showed faces worn down by life, the homeless, the addicted, the forgotten veterans, the drifters, people without tether, without a safety net. 40 people, Mark," she said, tapping a photo of a young man with hollow eyes and a scar on his chin. "Elias Thorne, 24 years old, discharged from the Marines with severe PTSD. He was picked up by social services in Portland for disturbing the peace. A judge-mandated psychiatric care. He was transferred to Blackwood Asylum on November 14th. That was 2 years ago. No visitation logs. No discharge papers. No death certificate. He just ceased to exist. Maybe he was transferred," Mark argued, though his resistance was weakening. He walked back to the desk, looking down at Elias Thorne's face. "I checked every state facility in the tri-state area. I checked the morgues. I checked the federal databases," Sarah said, her voice tightening. "He didn't leave Blackwood. None of them did. And then there's the source." She pulled a single sheet of paper from the bottom of the stack. It was a printout of an encrypted email, stripped of metadata, the sender routed through a dozen proxy servers in Eastern Europe. "They aren't treating them. They are rewriting them. Project Monarch didn't end in the 70s. It just went private. Look at the Phase 4 clinical trials. Look at the sensory deprivation wing. If you come, don't come as a reporter. Come as a ghost. It's the only way you'll see the machine from the inside." Mark read the words for the 10th time. He rubbed his temples, a headache blooming behind his eyes. "Anonymous tips are wind, Sarah. You know that. This could be a disgruntled janitor. Could be a trap." "It mentions Phase 4, Sarah pointed out. "I cross-referenced the medical supply manifest requests for Blackwood. Last month, they ordered industrial quantities of scopolamine and heavy-grade electroshock components that haven't been standard practice since the one flew over the cuckoo's nest era. Someone is building a nightmare up there, and they are using human beings as the bricks." Mark sighed, a long, defeated sound. He sank back into his chair, looking at Sarah with a mixture of professional admiration and paternal terror. "So, that's it then? You've made up your mind. You're gonna play the lead role in your own horror movie." "I've spent 3 months building the legend of Jane Doe," Sarah said, her voice shifting, becoming clinical, detached. "I've planted the arrest records. I've staged the psychotic episodes in public shelters. I've stopped washing my hair. I've stopped eating properly. By the time I walk through those gates, Sarah Bennett will be gone. There will only be Jane, a paranoid schizophrenic with no next of kin, a danger to herself and others, a ward of the state." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, unassuming plastic case. Inside sat a plain gray button, identical to the ones on the standard-issue hospital scrubs used in state facilities. "The lens is a 4K micro-aperture," she explained, holding it up to the light. "It has a battery life of 300 hours on standby, motion-activated. It records to a micro SD card the size of a fingernail. I'll sew it into the uniform myself. If they search me, it's just a button. If they scan me, it's passive plastic. It's invisible." Mark looked at the button, then at Sarah. "And if they catch you? If they find out you're recording? Then you have the kill switch," Sarah said, meeting his gaze. "If I don't check in via the dead drop signal, 3 missed calls to your burner phone at exactly 3 a.m. on the 14th day, you publish everything. You burn them down from the outside. If I publish without your testimony, without the footage, it's just speculation. They'll sue us into oblivion," Mark said softly. "But that's not what worries me. What worries me is that if you don't call, it means you can't." Sarah stood up, gathering the files. The movement was final. "I have to do this, Mark. Elias Thorne deserves a name. They all do." Mark watched her pack the evidence of her own reckless courage away. He wanted to forbid it. He wanted to call security and have her escorted out for her own safety. But he knew Sarah Bennett. She would go with or without his blessing. If he said no, she would go alone without a safety net. 14 days, Mark whispered, his voice cracking. Not an hour more. The drive to Montana was a journey through the layers of civilization, peeling them back one by one until only the raw, indifferent bone of the earth remained. Sarah drove her battered sedan, the heater rattling against the encroaching chill. She left Seattle's gray drizzle behind, crossing the invisible line where the city surrendered to the sprawling, silent forests. As the miles ticked by on the odometer, Sarah Bennett began to dismantle herself. She stopped at a gas station restroom somewhere outside of Spokane. The fluorescent light buzzed like a dying fly. In the cracked mirror, she looked at her reflection. She took a pair of scissors from her bag and hacked at her hair, destroying the expensive salon cut, leaving jagged, uneven clumps that framed her face in chaos. She scrubbed the makeup from her skin, then rubbed dirt from the floor into her pores, darkening the circles under her eyes. She stared into her own pupils. "You are not Sarah," she told herself. "You are Jane. You hear voices. They whisper in the walls. They tell you the government is watching. You are scared. You are alone. You are broken." She practiced the twitch, a subtle tremor in her left hand, a nervous tic she had researched that was common in patients with high anxiety psychosis. She let her jaw go slack. She let the intelligence drain from her eyes, replacing it with a feral, hunted look. By the time she walked out of that restroom, the journalist was buried deep in the psyche, hidden behind a fortress of madness she had constructed brick by brick. The final leg of the journey was a blur of snow and winding mountain roads. The GPS signal had died an hour ago, leaving her to navigate by the rusted road signs that pointed toward Blackwood State Penitentiary and Psychiatric Facility. The air grew thinner, sharper. The pine trees loomed on either side of the road like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, bowing as if in mourning. And then she saw it. Blackwood Asylum did not look like a hospital. It looked like a tomb for the living. It sat perched on a rocky outcropping, a monstrosity of Victorian Gothic architecture, its stone walls stained dark by decades of harsh winters. Iron bars covered every window. High fences topped with razor wire spiraled around the perimeter, glistening maliciously in the fading twilight. Sarah stopped the car at the final checkpoint before the main gate. She turned off the engine. The silence of the mountain was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered sound. She took a deep breath, inhaling the cold air that smelled of pine and impending snow. She touched the collar of her shirt, where the button would soon reside. This was the event horizon. Once she crossed it, gravity would change. Rules would change. Reality would be whatever the doctors at Blackwood said it was. She opened the car door and stepped out into the freezing wind. 2 guards were approaching from the gatehouse, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, their hands resting on the batons at their belts. Sarah didn't stand tall. She didn't square her shoulders. Instead, she hunched over, wrapping her arms around herself, and let out a whimper that was half-acting, half-genuine terror. She began to mutter to herself, a rapid-fire stream of nonsense about radio waves and poison in the water. The guards exchanged a look of boredom, of routine cruelty. Looks like another stray for the collection. One of them grunted, spitting onto the snow. "Hey, lady!" The other shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You lost?" Sarah looked up, letting her eyes widen, letting the madness spill out. "They're coming!" she shrieked, pointing at the empty road behind her. "The static! Can't you hear the static?" As the guards moved in to restrain her, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel, Sarah felt a cold knot of satisfaction tighten in her stomach. They bought it. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see. They grabbed her arms, rough and dismissive. They didn't see the predator hiding inside the prey. They didn't see the camera. They didn't see the downfall of their entire empire. As they dragged her toward the yawning, iron mouth of the main gate, the heavy metal doors began to creak open with a sound like a dying beast. Sarah Bennett took one last look at the sky, at the free world, before the shadow of Blackwood swallowed her whole. The heavy iron gates of Blackwood Asylum did not close with a clang. They sealed with a hydraulic hiss, a sound like a giant lung exhaling the last breath of the free world. Sarah Bennett, now officially Jane Doe, patient 409, felt the vibration of the lock engaging through the soles of her shoes. The transition was instant and absolute. The biting wind of the Montana mountains was cut off, replaced by an air that was stagnant, recycled, and heavy with the chemical tang of industrial disinfectant, masking the underlying scent of unwashed bodies and fear. She was not walked into the facility. She was heralded. 2 orderlies, thick-necked men with eyes devoid of curiosity, flanked her, gripping her arms with enough force to bruise. Sarah let her body go limp, a dead weight they had to drag. It was part of the performance. Jane was catatonic, terrified, reacting to stimuli that weren't there. But beneath the curtain of her matted hair, Sarah's eyes were darting, recording, analyzing. Security cameras at every junction. Convex mirrors on the corners. Keycard access only. No visible windows on the ground floor. They brought her to the intake room, a space tiled entirely in white ceramic that amplified every sound. The glare of the fluorescent strips overhead was blinding, designed to strip away comfort, to leave you exposed. Jane Doe, found wandering Route 9. No ID. Probable schizophrenia, paranoid type. The guard muttered to the intake nurse. The nurse didn't look up. She was a severe woman behind a glass partition, stamping forms with a rhythmic thud-thud-thud that sounded like a slow heartbeat. Strip her. Delouse her. Ward C. The process of stripping a human being of their dignity is a precise science at Blackwood. Sarah was shoved into a stall. Her clothes, the carefully selected thrift store rags she had worn to build her cover, were torn from her body. She made a show of resisting, shrieking about the wires and the signals, thrashing just enough to force the orderlies to pin her against the cold tiles. "Easy, crazy," one of them grunted, twisting her wrist. It was in this chaos, this carefully orchestrated struggle, that Sarah made her move. As they ripped her coat away, her hand brushed against the hem of her inner shirt, where a small adhesive patch sat against her skin. With a sleight of hand practiced 100 times in her apartment, she peeled the tiny, wafer-thin memory card and the microlens unit. no bigger than a shirt button, into her palm. As they forced her arms behind her back, she curled her fingers tight, the plastic biting into her palm, her lifeline to the outside world. Then came the water. It wasn't a shower. It was a hose. Freezing water blasted her, stealing the breath from her lungs, shocking her system into silence. They scrubbed her with rough brushes and harsh soap that smelled of lye. It was a baptism of submission. By the time they threw the gray cotton uniform at her, she was shivering violently, her skin raw and red. "Get dressed," the guard ordered, turning his back with indifferent modesty. Sarah fumbled with the coarse fabric, her fingers numb. She pulled the gray tunic over her head. As she did, she slipped the device from her palm to the inside of the collar. It was a precarious transfer. She needed a needle and thread, or at least tape, to secure it properly. For now, it was wedged into the fold of the fabric, held only by friction and luck. She was marched down a long, echoing corridor. The deeper they went into the bowels of Blackwood, the heavier the atmosphere became. The walls here were not white but a suffocating pale green, the color of old bruises. Sounds drifted from behind closed doors. Low moans, manic laughter, and a rhythmic banging that sounded like someone hitting their head against a wall, over and over again. They stopped at a double door marked Ward C, General Population. The orderly swiped a keycard. The doors buzzed and swung open. If the intake room was purgatory, Ward C was the first circle of hell. It was a cavernous room lined with 24 metal beds. There were no partitions, no privacy. The patients were a tableau of broken humanity. Some paced in tight circles, muttering to invisible companions. Others sat on their beds, rocking back and forth, staring at nothing. "Fresh meat!" A voice cackled from the corner, followed by a wet, hacking cough. The orderly shoved Sarah forward. "Bed 14. Lights out in 20 minutes. Don't make trouble, and trouble won't find you." The doors swung shut behind her. Sarah stood alone in the center of the room. She hugged herself, affecting the posture of the terrified victim, but her mind was racing. Count the staff. Observe the routine. Find the anomaly. She shuffled toward bed 14. It was a cot with a mattress as thin as a slice of bread and a single scratchy wool blanket. As she sat down, the springs groaned. "You don't belong here." The voice was a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. Sarah stiffened. She turned her head slowly, keeping her movements jagged. In the bed next to hers, bed 13, sat an old man. He was skeletal, his skin like parchment paper stretched over brittle bones. But his eyes were shockingly clear. They were not the cloudy, medicated eyes of the others. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a profound, terrifying sadness. Sarah maintained her act. She rocked back and forth, whispering, "The static. Stop the static. You can drop it." The old man whispered again, not looking at her, staring straight ahead at the blank wall. "At least for a minute. The cameras have blind spots. If you sit exactly where you are, the pillar blocks the lens in the corner." Sarah paused. Her heart skipped a beat. She risked a glance at the ceiling. He was right. A structural concrete pillar obscured the direct line of sight from the camera mounted above the door. She leaned in, her voice dropping the frantic pitch of Jane Doe, returning to the steel of Sarah Bennett. "Who are you?" "I'm Henry," the old man said softly. "I used to be a history teacher. Then I was a drunk. Now I'm just subject 408. "Subject?" Sarah asked, the word hanging heavy in the air. Henry turned to face her. His face was a map of tragedy. "You're not crazy, girl. I can see it. You walk like someone who has a destination. People in here, we don't have destinations. We just have circles." "I'm here to find someone," Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively going to the button hidden in her collar. "Elias Thorne. Do you know him?" Henry flinched. The name struck him like a physical blow. He looked around nervously, his hands trembling. "Don't say that name. Not here. Not ever." "Why?" Elias was the first of the new batch," Henry stammered. his voice dropping so low Sarah had to strain to hear. He was in bed 14. Your bed. He was a good boy. Strong. But they took him to the East Wing. The East Wing, Sarah repeated. It was the location mentioned in the anonymous email. Nobody comes back from the East Wing the same, Henry said, a tear leaking from his eye. Elias came back. Hollow. He stopped eating, stopped speaking. He just sat there and stared at the sun until his retinas burned. Then one night, they came and took him away for disposal. That's what they called it. Disposal. Before Sarah could press him further, the heavy metal door at the far end of the ward banged open. The room instantly fell silent. Even the manic pacers froze. A woman stepped in. She was flanked by 2 nurses, but she commanded the space with the presence of a general. She was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a pristine white uniform that seemed to repel the grime of the asylum. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it pulled the skin of her face taut. Head Nurse Miller. She walked down the center aisle, her heels clicking on the linoleum like hammer strikes. She carried a clipboard in one hand and a small metal tray in the other. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Miller announced. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a predator mimicking a caregiver. "Time for your vitamins. We want everyone sleeping soundly tonight, don't we?" She moved from bed to bed. The patients didn't just accept the medication. They cowered before her. Sarah watched as a large man in bed 8 opened his mouth like a baby bird, swallowing the pills without water. His eyes fixed on Miller's face with a look of pure abject terror. When Miller reached bed 13, she paused. She looked down at Henry with a smile that was all teeth. "Henry," she purred, "my favorite historian. How are we feeling today? Are the battles of 1812 still raging in your head?" "I'm fine, Nurse Miller," Henry whispered, staring at his knees. "You look agitated," she noted, her eyes narrowing. She placed 2 blue pills and a small paper cup of water on his nightstand. "Take them. We can't have you dreaming bad dreams." Henry took the pills with a shaking hand and swallowed them. Miller watched his throat, ensuring he didn't cheek them. Satisfied, she turned to Sarah. Sarah felt the woman's gaze physically, like a cold draft. Miller looked her up and down, analyzing her like a specimen in a jar. "So this is the new stray," Miller said. "Jane Doe." Sarah resumed her rocking, mumbling nonsense. "Don't let them in. The ceiling has eyes." Miller chuckled softly. "Oh, the ceiling has more than eyes, dear. Open up." She held out a small paper cup containing 2 pills. One was white, the other a vivid, translucent blue. The same blue Sarah had seen in Henry's hand. Sarah knew the drill. If she refused, they would force it. If she fought, they would sedate her intravenously, and she would lose control. She had to play the game. She opened her mouth. Miller tipped the cup. The pills hit Sarah's tongue, bitter and chalky. "Good girl," Miller said. "Swallow." Sarah gulped, using her tongue to slide the pills into the hidden pocket of her cheek, a trick she had practiced with Tic Tacs for weeks. She swallowed a mouthful of water, exaggerating the motion of her throat. Miller leaned in close, bringing her face inches from Sarah's. She smelled of peppermint and rubbing alcohol. She reached out and gripped Sarah's jaw, squeezing hard, forcing her mouth open again. Miller peered inside, sweeping her flashlight beam across Sarah's teeth, under her tongue. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The pills were tucked deep in the gum line, dangerously close to slipping out. "Clean," Miller pronounced, releasing Sarah's jaw with a shove. "Sleep tight, Jane. Tomorrow we begin your assessment." Miller turned on her heel and marched out, her retinue following. The heavy doors slammed shut. The lights in the ward buzzed and died, leaving only the red glow of the emergency exit signs and the pale moonlight filtering through the high, barred windows. Sarah waited. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Around her, the breathing of the other patients began to change. The shallow, anxious breaths of the day deepened into heavy, chemically induced snores. The drugs were fast-acting. Sarah slowly spat the dissolving pills into her hand. They were slimy and half-melted. She wiped the residue on the underside of the mattress frame, grimacing at the bitter taste lingering in her mouth. "You didn't take them," a voice whispered from the darkness. Sarah turned. Henry was awake, staring at her. "No," Sarah whispered back. "And neither did you." Henry smiled, a ghostly expression in the dark. He reached under his pillow and produced the 2 blue pills intact. "I've been spitting them out for a month. It's the only reason I remember my wife's name." "Henry," Sarah whispered, moving to the edge of her bed to bridge the gap between them. "I need to see the East Wing. I need to know what they are doing." "You have a death wish," Henry hissed. "The East Wing is locked down. Biometric scanners. Guards." "I have this," Sarah said. She reached into her collar and pulled out the button camera. In the dim light, she manipulated the tiny casing, activating the recording mode. A microscopic red LED blinked once, then vanished. "This sees everything. If I can get footage, proof of what they're doing, I can burn this place to the ground." Henry looked at the device with wonder. "You're a spy." "I'm a journalist." "It's worse," Sarah corrected. She pulled a small sewing kit, a needle and a spool of gray thread she had unraveled from the hem of her sock, out of her hair, where she had wound it into a messy knot. "Keep watch," she commanded softly. Working by the faint red light of the exit sign, Sarah began to sew. She positioned the camera lens directly over the second buttonhole of her tunic. Her fingers flew, stitching the casing securely to the fabric. Every stitch was a prayer. Every knot was a promise to Elias Thorne and every other lost soul. As she worked, a sound drifted through the ventilation duct above their heads. It wasn't the wind. It was a scream, but it wasn't a normal scream of pain. It was a distorted electronic shriek, like a human voice being played through a broken synthesizer. Sarah froze, the needle hovering in midair. "What is that?" Henry pulled his blanket up to his chin, his eyes wide with terror. "That's the tuning," he whispered. "They're tuning someone up in the lab." "Tuning?" "Rewiring the brain," Henry said. "Dr. Vance. He calls it optimizing the human hard drive. He erases the memories, the personality, and he puts something else in." "Who is Dr. Vance?" "The man in the white suit. He comes at night. He only talks to Miller. He never looks at us. He just looks at his charts." Henry paused, his voice trembling. "He looked at me yesterday, Jane. He pointed at me." Sarah finished the last stitch. She bit the thread, securing the camera. She patted the hidden device. It was ready. She was ready. "They won't take you, Henry," Sarah said fiercely. "I won't let them." "You can't stop them," Henry said, turning away to face the wall. "Blackwood is a machine. It eats, it digests, and it excretes. We are just the food." Sarah lay back on her thin mattress. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She was inside. She had her eyes. She had an ally, however fragile. She closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She listened to the distant, electronic screams echoing through the vents, visualizing the map of the building she had memorized. The East Wing is connected to the main block by a service tunnel in the basement. Access via the laundry chute or the maintenance elevator. Tomorrow, Jane Doe would have an episode. She would create a diversion. And while the orderlies were distracted, Sarah Bennett would go hunting. But as the night wore on, the screaming stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. Sarah lay in the dark, staring at the red exit sign, knowing that the only way out of Blackwood was to go deeper into the darkness first. Suddenly, the heavy door to the ward clicked. It wasn't the morning shift. It was too early. The door eased open. A silhouette stood there, backlit by the hallway lights. It wasn't a nurse. It was a figure in a tailored suit, the white fabric glowing almost distinctively in the gloom. Dr. Vance. He stood there for a long moment, scanning the room. His gaze swept over the sleeping forms, over the drugged and the broken. Then his head turned. He looked straight at bed 13. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted to bed 14. Sarah didn't move. She didn't breathe. She slowed her heart rate, forcing her body to mimic sleep. Vance stepped into the room. He moved silently, like a ghost floating over the floor. He stopped at the foot of Sarah's bed. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical weight. She could smell him, not antiseptic, but expensive cologne and stale tobacco. He leaned in, looking at her face. Sarah kept her eyes shut, her jaw slack. "Interesting," Vance whispered. His voice was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Very interesting." He turned to Henry's bed. He tapped the clipboard he was holding. "Prepare subject 408 for transfer," Vance whispered into a lapel microphone. "And keep an eye on the new one. Her REM cycle is inconsistent." He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Sarah opened her eyes in the darkness. Her blood ran cold. He knew, or at least he suspected. Her cover wasn't as perfect as she thought. She looked at Henry. The old man was feigning sleep, but his hand was gripping the blanket so tight his knuckles were white. The game had changed. She didn't have days. She might not even have hours. Sarah touched the button on her chest. Recording started. Morning in Blackwood Asylum did not break. It leaked in. The high, barred windows turned from black to a bruised purple, and then to a sickly, institutional gray. There was no rooster crowing, only the distant, grinding hydraulic whine of the main boiler firing up in the basement, sending tremors through the floorboards that Sarah felt in her teeth. She had not slept. Her eyes felt gritty, lined with sand, but her mind was razor-sharp, humming with the artificial adrenaline of survival. Beside her, bed 13 was a landscape of restless terror. Henry had spent the night muttering names of dead platoons and forgotten battles, his hands clutching the thin wool blanket as if it were the edge of a foxhole. At 6 o'clock sharp, the lights slammed on. Not a gentle fade-in, but an instantaneous, retina-searing assault of fluorescent white. A collective groan rose from the ward, the sound of 30 broken souls being dragged back into a reality they desperately wanted to escape. Up, everyone up. Inspection in 5. The morning shift orderlies banged their batons against the metal door frames. The noise was deafening, a deliberate tactic to disorient the patients before they could form a coherent thought. Sarah swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her body ached from the thin mattress, but she forced herself into the hunch of Jane Doe. She let her mouth hang slightly open, her eyes unfocused, staring at a spot on the floor 3 feet in front of her. "Henry," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "Henry, look at me." The old man sat up slowly. He looked 10 years older than he had the night before. His skin was waxy, a grayish pallor that spoke of a heart giving up. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers with a desperate intensity. "They're coming today," he whispered. "I can feel it. The schedule. Vance's schedule. He never visits the ward unless a harvest is due." "I need to get to the East Wing before they do," Sarah hissed, fumbling with her shoelaces, her clumsy fingers a performance for the cameras. "How do I get there, Henry? You said you saw the map." Henry looked toward the door where the orderlies were shouting at a confused patient who had wet the bed. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of decay and stale mint. "The laundry," he murmured. "The dirty linen exchange happens at 10 a.m. during rec hour. The carts, they go down to the central wash in the basement. There's a service corridor behind the boilers. Connects to the East Wing intake. But it's hot, Jane. It's so hot down there. Bed 14. Stop conspiring and make your bed." A baton slammed against the metal frame of Sarah's cot. She flinched violently, a genuine reaction amplified for show, and began to tuck the sheets with frantic, clumsy motions, gibbering about the clean lines and keeping the edges straight. The orderly, a man with a thick neck and a cruel boredom in his eyes, watched her for a moment, satisfied with her fear, before moving on. Breakfast was a march of the damned. The patients were herded into the cafeteria, a cavernous room that smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner. The noise was a dull roar of plastic trays clattering and the low murmur of voices. Sarah took her place in line, receiving a scoop of gray, gelatinous oatmeal and a cup of lukewarm water. She scanned the room. The layout was a panopticon. A central guard tower rose in the middle of the room, glass-walled, where 2 guards watched monitors. Cameras were everywhere. But Henry was right. The system had flaws. The sheer volume of visual data meant the guards were complacent. They were watching for fights, for riots. They weren't looking for a spy. Sarah sat next to Henry at a long metal table. He was staring at his oatmeal, his spoon hovering in midair. "Eat, Henry," she said softly. "You need strength." "Strength for what?" he replied, his voice cracking. "To scream louder? To run," Sarah said. "When I make my move, there's going to be chaos. If you can get to the fire exit in the North Hall. I jammed the sensor yesterday with chewing gum. It won't alarm." Henry shook his head slowly. "I can't run, Jane. My legs. They took the run out of me years ago. But you run. You run for Elias. You run for all of us." He reached into his pocket and slid something across the table under the cover of his napkin. Sarah placed her hand over it. It was cold, hard metal. A small, rusted maintenance key. "The chute," he whispered. "The lock on the laundry chute in the rec room. It's old. This might turn it." Suddenly, the air in the cafeteria changed. The low murmur of conversation died out instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. The double doors at the far end swung open. Nurse Miller entered, but this time she wasn't alone. Dr. Vance was with her. He looked even more out of place in the daylight. His white suit was pristine, a stark contrast to the grime of the asylum. He wore sunglasses, hiding his eyes, making him look like a blind executioner. Behind them walked 4 large men in tactical gear, not standard orderlies but private security. They carried stun batons and wore zip-tie cuffs on their belts. Sarah felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. They weren't waiting for nightfall. "Enjoying your breakfast?" Vance's voice projected across the silent room, smooth and cultured. He didn't use a megaphone. The acoustics carried his voice like a curse. "We have a schedule change today. Subject 408. Please stand up." Every eye in the room turned to their table. Henry froze. A single drop of oatmeal fell from his spoon, splashing onto the metal table with a tiny, wet sound that seemed deafening. "Henry," Sarah whispered, her hand tightening around the key under the napkin. "Don't." Subject 408. Vance repeated, stepping closer. The tactical team fanned out, their hands hovering over their weapons. "Mr. Henry Gale, we have a treatment waiting. It would be rude to keep the machine waiting." Henry dropped his spoon, clattered loudly. He stood up, his legs shaking so violently the bench rattled. He looked at Vance, then at Miller, and finally down at Sarah. "Remember me," he whispered. "Get him," Vance ordered, bored. The tactical team moved in. They didn't walk. They swarmed. 2 of them grabbed Henry by the arms. "No!" Henry shouted, a sudden burst of frantic energy taking hold. "No, I won't go back. You can't scrub me. I am Henry Gale. I was a teacher. I have a name." He kicked out, catching one of the guards in the shin. The guard grunted and swung his baton, striking Henry in the ribs. The sound of the impact, a dull, meaty thud, sickened Sarah. She half rose from her seat, her journalist instincts screaming to intervene, to document, to fight. But the spy, the cold, calculating part of her that was recording this entire nightmare through the lens in her button, held her back. "If you move, you die. If you die, the tape dies. If the tape dies, Henry dies for nothing. Restrain him," Miller barked. The guards slammed Henry face first onto the table. Sarah flinched as his oatmeal tray went flying, splattering across her uniform. Henry was screaming now, a raw, animal sound of pure despair. They zip-tied his hands behind his back and hauled him up, dragging him toward the exit. "Jane!" Henry screamed, looking back at her, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "The basement! Go to the basement!" The entire cafeteria was watching. The guards in the tower were standing up, hands on their radios. Sarah knew this was it. This was the distraction, The entire security force was focused on the screaming old man being dragged out the door. The orderlies were moving to contain the other patients who were beginning to shout and bang their trays in a sympathetic riot. Sarah slipped the key into her sleeve. She didn't look at Henry again. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Instead, she dropped to the floor, crawling under the table. She moved fast, scrambling on her hands and knees through the forest of legs and bolted down stools. She headed away from the exit, toward the service doors that led to the kitchen and the loading docks. "Sit down. Everyone sit down or we gas the room." The loudspeakers boomed. In the chaos, no one noticed one gray-clad figure slip through the swinging doors into the scullery. The kitchen was a cloud of steam. Dishwashers roared, drowning out the shouting from the cafeteria. Sarah stood up, wiping the oatmeal from her chest, checking the camera. The red light was blinking. It had seen everything. Vance's face, the tactical gear, the assault on a geriatric patient. She moved through the steam, keeping her head down. A kitchen worker, a trustee inmate with a hairnet, looked up as she passed. He saw the intensity in her eyes, the lack of madness, and he looked away, scrubbing a pot harder. He knew better than to see things. Sarah exited the rear of the kitchen into the service corridor. This was the spine of the building, a long, concrete hallway used for moving supplies and waste. It was empty. She ran. Her rubber-soled shoes squeaked on the linoleum. She reached the door marked laundry chute, access. She tried the handle. Locked. She pulled the rusty key from her sleeve. Her hands were shaking so bad she dropped it once. Clattered on the floor. She gasped, snatching it up, jamming it into the keyhole. She twisted. The metal groaned, resisted, and then, click, she pulled the door open. Inside was a small room containing 3 large industrial laundry hoppers. In the center of the wall was a circular metal hatch, huge and gaping, like the mouth of a cannon. 10 a.m. The drop. She checked her watch. She could hear the rumble of the carts approaching from the floors above. The chute was a gravity feed. If she jumped in, she would slide all the way to the basement. It was madness. It was suicide. She climbed up onto the lip of the chute. The smell wafting up was nauseating, soiled sheets, bleach, and something metallic, like old blood. "Hey, you!" Sarah froze. She looked back. Standing at the end of the corridor was Dr. Vance. He wasn't with his guards. He was alone, holding a lit cigarette, staring at her with mild curiosity. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. "You're remarkably resourceful for a schizophrenic, Jane," he said, taking a drag. "Or should I say, Miss Bennett?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. He knew. He had known the whole time. "You have nowhere to go, Sarah?" Vance said, walking slowly toward her, his heels clicking, echoing the same way Miller's did. "That chute leads to the incinerator staging area. It's a dead end, just like your career." He stopped 10 feet away. He reached into his jacket. Sarah braced herself for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a small remote control. "I can lock down this entire sector with one button," he said. "Give me the camera, and I'll let you leave. You can walk out the front gate. You can write a story about how we are underfunded and overworked. We'll even give you a quote." Sarah looked at the remote, then at the black abyss of the chute behind her. "What did you do to Elias?" she asked, her voice steady. Vance smiled. "Elias is pioneer. He's helping us map the human soul. You should be proud of him." "You're a monster," Sarah said. "I'm a scientist," Vance corrected. He took a step forward. "Give me the camera." Sarah looked him in the eye. She touched the button on her chest one last time. "Smile," she whispered. Then, she threw herself backward into the darkness. Vance lunged, but he was too late. The sensation of falling was terrifying. Sarah tumbled through the slick metal tube, her body banging against the sides. She was sliding down a spiral of darkness, picking up speed. The air rushed past her ears, roaring like a train. She squeezed her eyes shut, tucking her chin to her chest, praying she wouldn't break her neck at the bottom. The slide lasted for 5 seconds that felt like 5 years. Suddenly, The angle of the chute leveled out. She shot out of the end of the tube, flying through the air. She landed hard on a mountain of soft, damp canvas. Piles of laundry. Sarah gasped. The wind knocked out of her. She rolled down the side of the laundry hill, landing on a cold concrete floor. She lay there for a moment, staring up at the high, vaulted ceiling of the basement. The air here was different. It was hot, oppressively hot, and it vibrated with a low, thrumming sound. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat. She scrambled to her feet, checking her body. Bruised, sore, but nothing broken. She checked the camera. It was still there, blinking red. She was in the sorting room. Giant industrial washing machines lined the walls, churning with hypnotic rhythm. But the room was empty of people. She saw a sign on the far wall, rusted and barely legible. East Wing, authorized personnel only. It pointed down a dark, narrow tunnel where steam pipes hissed and leaked. Sarah started to move toward it, but then she heard the sound. It came from the chute she had just exited. A metallic clank, then a slide. Someone was following her. She didn't wait to see if it was Vance or his guards. She bolted toward the tunnel. The tunnel was a nightmare of industrial decay. The heat grew more intense with every step. The lights were dim, caged bulbs that flickered and buzzed. The walls were wet with condensation. Sarah ran until her lungs burned. The tunnel opened up into a large circular antechamber. In the center of the room stood a massive steel door, thick as a bank vault. There was no handle, only a keypad and a retinal scanner. "Damn it!" Sarah cursed, slamming her hand against the cold steel. She was trapped. The footsteps behind her were getting louder, heavy boots running on concrete. She looked around desperately. To her right, there was a ventilation grate screwed shut. To her left, a panel of circuit breakers. She ran to the breaker panel and ripped the cover off. It was a mess of wires. If she could short the door mechanism, maybe it would default to open. Or maybe it would lock down forever. "Sarah," the voice echoed from the tunnel entrance. It was Vance, and he wasn't alone. She could hear the distinct racking of a shotgun slide. "End of the line," Vance shouted, his voice distorted by the tunnel's acoustics. Sarah grabbed a handful of wires. She didn't know red from blue. She just knew she needed energy. She pulled. Sparks showered down on her face, hot and stinging. The lights in the antechamber died instantly. The heavy steel door let out a groan. The magnetic locks disengaged with a sound like a thunderclap. The door drifted open just an inch. A blinding blue light spilled out from the crack. And with it, a sound. A sound that wasn't human. It was a choir of whispers, thousands of voices overlapping, crying out in a language that sounded like static. Sarah squeezed through the crack just as a shotgun blast blew the circuit panel off the wall where she had been standing a second ago. She tumbled into the room beyond and kicked the door shut. She jammed a loose metal pipe through the wheel handle, barring it. She turned around. She was in the East Wing, but it wasn't a hospital. It was a theater, an operating theater the size of a cathedral. And in the center, suspended in a tank of glowing blue liquid, was a man. Wires trailed from his skull, floating like jellyfish tentacles. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, staring at everything. It was Elias Thorne, but he wasn't dead. He looked at Sarah, through the glass, through the liquid, through the madness. And inside her head, a voice that wasn't hers spoke clearly. "Run." The voice in her head did not sound like a sound. It felt like a memory she hadn't formed yet. A cold spike of thought inserted directly into the base of her skull. "Run." The word reverberated through Sarah's nervous system, bypassing her ears entirely, causing her vision to blur for a fraction of a second. She staggered back from the glass tank, her breath fogging the cold surface, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Elias Thorne floated in the suspension of viscous, glowing blue fluid, his limbs drifting lazily like seaweed in a tide. He was naked, his body emaciated, skin translucent enough to show the map of blue veins beneath, veins that pulsed in time with the rhythmic thrumming of the machinery surrounding the tank. But it was the wires that made Sarah's stomach churn. They weren't just attached to him, they were integrated. Sleek, silver filaments wove into his scalp, burrowing into the bone, trailing upward into a heavy, industrial canopy of electronics that hummed with a terrifying amount of power. Sarah blinked, forcing the nausea down. She touched the button on her chest, a reflex now, reassuring herself that the red LED was still blinking, still witnessing this atrocity. "I have you, Elias," she thought, though she didn't dare speak aloud. "I have you." The room she had stumbled into, the East Wing, was a cathedral of nightmares. It was vast, the ceiling lost in shadows 3 stories up, supported by steel girders that looked like the ribcage of a leviathan. The floor was a grid of steel grating, beneath which thick bundles of cables coiled like sleeping snakes, glowing with that same eerie, pulsating blue light. And stretching out before her, row upon row, were the tanks. There wasn't just one. There were dozens. Sarah moved away from the door she had barred, stepping deeper into the room. The air here was freezing, chilled to preserve the biological processors floating in their glass coffins. It smelled of ozone and ionized air, the smell of a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle. As she walked down the central aisle, she looked left and right, her camera sweeping across the faces of the lost. She recognized them. Not all, but enough. There was the man from the bus stop in Seattle who used to sing opera to pigeons, Subject 312, according to the digital readout on his tank. There was the woman who had vanished from the shelter in Spokane 3 years ago, Subject 289. They were suspended in a state of ageless, dreamless animation, their eyes open, their pupils dilated to encompass the entire iris, staring into the void. "Run." The voice came again, louder this time, accompanied by a sharp headache behind Sarah's eyes. It wasn't just Elias. It was a chorus, a low, dissonant hum of 100 voices whispering over one another, a hive mind of static and pain. Sarah stumbled, grabbing a railing for support. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the freezing air. She reached a central console, a circular desk dominated by a bank of monitors. The screens were cascading with data, complex waveforms, neural maps, and streams of code that moved too fast for the human eye to track. She didn't need to understand the code to understand the intent. She saw a file lying on the desk, a physical hard copy stamped with the Blackwood emblem and a red "Top Secret // DOD clearance" watermark. Her hands shaking, she flipped it open, angling her chest so the camera could read the text. Project Monarch, Phase 4, Integration Objective. To create a distributed organic processing network using human neural tissue as a biological substrate. By linking subjects via the cortex interface, individual consciousness is suppressed, allowing for massive parallel processing power for cryptographic decryption and predictive behavioral modeling. Sarah read the words, the horror settling in her gut like lead. They weren't curing these people. They weren't even just experimenting on them. They were turning them into a computer, a human supercomputer built from the stolen minds of the unwanted. A loud screech of metal tearing metal echoed from the entrance behind her. Sarah spun around. Sparks were showering from the heavy steel door she had barred. A blade of blue fire, an oxyacetylene torch, was slicing through the locking mechanism. Dr. Vance wasn't knocking anymore. He was burning his way in. "Time to go," she whispered to herself. She scanned the vast room for an exit. At the far end, past the rows of tanks, she saw a heavy blast door marked emergency ventilation/surface access. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot. She started to run, her rubber soles slapping against the metal grating. As she passed the tanks, the whispering in her head grew louder, a cacophony of pleas. "Help us. Cold. Dark. Alone." It was disorienting, like trying to run through a crowd that was grabbing at her clothes. But the hands were invisible, spectral fingers brushing against her mind. She reached the halfway point of the room when the main door behind her groaned and gave way with a thunderous crash. The pipe she had jammed in the wheel handle clattered to the floor. "Secure the perimeter. Lethal force authorized." Vance's voice boomed through the chamber, amplified by the acoustics. Sarah ducked behind a bank of servers, pressing her back against the warm metal casing. She peered around the edge. Vance strode in, flanked by 6 tactical officers. They moved with military precision, their weapon lights cutting through the gloom, sweeping the aisles. "She's in here," Vance said, his voice calm, terrifyingly reasonable. "Spread out. Watch the tanks. If a single bullet cracks a containment unit, the cost comes out of your pensions." Sarah crouched low, moving in a crouch run between the rows of tanks. She was small, fast, and motivated by a terror that was sharpening her senses to a razor's edge. She needed to reach that far door. She was 10 yards from the blast door when she saw him. Henry. He wasn't in a tank. Not yet. He was strapped to a gurney near a prep station, surrounded by surgical instruments. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes were rolling in his head, and he was mumbling, foaming slightly at the mouth. A nurse, not Miller, but a younger man in surgical scrubs, was shaving Henry's head, preparing him for the interface. Sarah froze. The spy told her to keep moving. The spy told her that Henry was already gone, that stopping would mean losing the footage, losing the story, losing everything. But Sarah Bennett, the woman who had held the hand of a dying source in a parking garage, couldn't take another step. She looked at the tactical team moving down the aisles behind her. They were closing the net. She looked at the blast door freedom. Then she looked at Henry. "Damn it," she hissed. She grabbed a heavy metal tray of surgical tools from a nearby cart. She weighed a scalpel in her hand, then discarded it for a heavy bone saw. It wasn't a weapon. It was a distraction. She stood up, exposing herself. "Hey, Vance!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Every flashlight beam in the room snapped toward her. She was blinded, a deer in the headlights of a semi-truck. "There!" a guard shouted. Sarah hurled the metal tray with all her strength. It didn't fly at the guards. It flew at the main power coupling on the wall next to Henry's prep station. A massive junction box glowing with warning lights. The tray connected. Crack zzzzttt. A shower of sparks exploded from the wall. The lights in the entire east wing flickered violently, then died, plunging the room into a darkness illuminated only by the ghostly blue glow of the tanks and the chaotic strobing of the damaged junction box. "Contact front. Switch to thermal," Vance shouted. In the confusion, Sarah lunged for Henry. The male nurse shouted in surprise, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She swung her elbow, catching him in the throat. He gagged and collapsed. "Henry!" Sarah screamed over the noise of the sparking electricity. She grabbed the straps binding his wrists, fumbling with the buckles. "Henry, wake up!" Henry's eyes focused on her, swimming up from a drug-induced haze. "Jane?" he rasped. "Angels?" "No angels, Henry. Just me," she grunted, freeing his left arm. "We have to move." "Can't," Henry whispered, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "Legs. They gave me the paralytic. I can't walk." Sarah's heart stopped. She looked down. His legs were dead weight. She couldn't carry him, not with a tactical team bearing down on them. "Go," Henry said, pushing her hand away. His voice was suddenly clear, the voice of the soldier he had been 50 years ago. "You have the camera. You have the truth. That's the mission. I am just a casualty. Go." "I won't leave you," Sarah cried, tears stinging her eyes. "You have to," Henry roared, a sound that seemed to draw the attention of every guard in the room. "Run, girl. Run and burn them down." A red laser dot appeared on Henry's chest, then another on Sarah's shoulder. "Drop it." Hands in the air. The tactical team had flanked them. They emerged from the darkness like wolves, their silhouettes backlit by the eerie blue glow of the tanks. Sarah looked at the blast door. It was 20 feet away. She looked at Henry. He was smiling, a sad, brave smile. "Tell them my name," he whispered. Sarah made a choice. It was the only choice she had. She turned and ran. She sprinted toward the blast door, her feet pounding the metal grate. Behind her, she heard the thwip-thwip of suppressed rifles. Bullets sparked off the floor around her feet. She didn't weave. She dove. She hit the crash bar of the blast door with her shoulder. It groaned and swung open. She tumbled out into the cold night air. Not freedom, but an exterior catwalk suspended over the cliff edge. The wind howled, whipping snow into her face. She scrambled to her feet, slamming the door shut and spinning the locking wheel. She heard thuds from the other side as the guards threw themselves against it. She was outside, but she was trapped. The catwalk was a dead end. It wrapped around the ventilation tower and ended at a sheer drop. Below her, hundreds of feet down, jagged rocks waited in the darkness. Above her, the sheer stone wall of the asylum rose into the storm. She pressed her back against the cold stone, gasping for air. The adrenaline was starting to crash, leaving her shaking and nauseous. She checked the camera, still recording. She needed to hide. She needed to transmit. She looked up. A drain pipe ran along the wall, leading up to the roof of the West Tower. It was icy, slick, and treacherous, but it was the only way up. She grabbed the cold metal, her fingers numb. She began to climb. The wind tore at her uniform, trying to peel her off the wall. Her muscles burned. Every inch was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. She was halfway up when the blast door below blew open. Vance stepped out onto the catwalk, his white suit flapping in the wind. He looked up, spotting her immediately against the gray stone. "Persistent," he shouted over the wind. He didn't signal his men to shoot. He simply watched. "Where do you think you're going, Sarah? There is no signal out here. The mountains kill it all." Sarah ignored him. She kept climbing. She reached the parapet of the roof and hauled herself over, collapsing onto the gravel surface covered in snow. She was on the roof of the highest tower. The view was terrifyingly beautiful, miles of nothing but snow and darkness. She fumbled in her pocket for the small wireless transmitter she had prepared days ago, a booster she intended to plug into the asylum's satellite dish. That was the plan. Reach the roof, hijack their own uplink, and broadcast the stream. She crawled toward the massive satellite dish in the center of the roof. Click. Floodlights snapped on, blinding her. Sarah shielded her eyes. She wasn't alone on the roof. Head nurse Miller was standing by the satellite dish. She was wearing a heavy wool coat over her uniform, holding a taser in one hand and a syringe in the other. "We knew you'd head for the high ground," Miller shouted, her voice cutting through the wind. "It's what rats do when the water rises." Sarah scrambled backward, but the door to the roof access burst open behind her. Two guards grabbed her arms, lifting her off her feet. "No," Sarah screamed, kicking and thrashing. "Let me go. It's over. I have everything." Vance emerged from the stairwell, breathless but composed. He walked over to Sarah, looking at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You have nothing," Vance said. "You are a patient at a mental health facility. You are delusional. You are violent." And tragically, he reached out and ripped the button from her collar. He held the tiny device up to the light, inspecting it. "You are prone to self-harm." Vance dropped the camera device onto the gravel and crushed it under the heel of his expensive Italian shoe. The plastic shattered. Sarah stared at the broken pieces. Her lifeline, her proof, gone. "No," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Take her to prep room 1, Vance ordered, turning away. "I want her processed immediately. No waiting period. Bypass the assessment." "And the memory wipe?" Miller asked, stepping forward with the syringe. Vance stopped. He looked back at Sarah, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "No," he said softly. "Not yet. I want her to remember this. I want her to be awake when we open her mind. I want to see exactly what a journalist looks like when she realizes she's become the headline." The guards dragged Sarah toward the door. She screamed, but the wind swallowed the sound. She dug her heels into the gravel, but it was useless. They were too strong. They dragged her down the stairs, deeper and deeper into the building. The air grew warmer, then hot. The smell of ozone returned. They didn't take her back to the ward. They didn't take her to the East Wing. They took her to a small, windowless room tiled in green. In the center of the room sat a heavy metal chair with leather straps. Beside it, a silver tray held a fresh syringe filled with glowing blue liquid. Sarah struggled as they forced her into the chair. The leather straps were tightened around her wrists, her ankles, her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Miller leaned over her face a mask of sadistic glee. She tapped the vein in Sarah's neck. "Comfortable, dear?" Miller whispered. Sarah looked up at the ceiling. A single camera blinked in the corner. A security camera. A thought sparked in her mind. A desperate, wild hope. The internal network. Vance said the subjects were a computer. Henry said they were connected. If she was about to be plugged into the system, maybe she didn't need the button camera. Maybe she didn't need the satellite dish. If they plugged her in, she would be inside the machine. Miller raised the needle. "Say goodbye to Sarah Bennett," Miller hissed. Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't scream. She focused. She focused on Elias. She focused on the static. She prepared to meet the monster on its own ground. The needle pierced her skin. The cold blue fire rushed into her veins. And the world dissolved into white. The world did not fade to black. It ignited into a blinding, agonizing azure. Sarah felt the plunger of the syringe depress, and the sensation was not of liquid entering her veins, but of liquid fire. It raced from her neck to her heart in a single, terrifying heartbeat, and then exploded outward, searing through her capillaries, hunting down every nerve ending in her body to set it ablaze. She wanted to scream, but her throat had paralyzed instantly. Her jaw was locked, her muscles seized in a rictus of silent agony. She was a statue made of pain, trapped in the chair, while the room around her began to warp. The green tiles of the walls elongated, stretching into infinite tunnels. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights deepened into a roar, like a waterfall of electricity. And then the walls fell away entirely. Sarah was no longer in the prep room. She was floating in a void. But it wasn't empty. It was crowded, suffocatingly crowded. It was a sea of static, a hurricane of whispering voices that clawed at her mind from every direction. She wasn't hearing them with her ears. She was feeling them resonate in her bones. Thousands of fragments of thoughts, memories, and fears crashed into her consciousness. She felt the cold of a park bench in winter. Subject 289. She tasted the copper tang of blood from a bitten lip. Subject 312. She felt the phantom pain of a missing leg. Subject 408. Integration complete. A cold, computerized voice echoed through the void. Node 409 online. Sarah gasped, or thought she did. She looked down at herself in this mental construct. She was made of light, frayed, flickering light. She realized with a dawning horror that she was inside the network. This was what Vance had built. He hadn't just erased these people. He had wired them together into a biological motherboard, a hive mind of suffering designed to process data for the highest bidder. "Help us." Cold. So cold. The voices were deafening. Sarah tried to push them back, to build the walls of her own identity, but the blue tide was eroding her shore. She felt her name slipping away. Sarah Bennett. Sarah. Jane. Node 409. No, she thought. The thought was small, fragile, like a candle in a storm. I am Sarah Bennett. I am a journalist. I am here to witness. Suddenly, a face loomed out of the static. It was huge, distorted, terrified. Henry. Jane? Henry's voice wasn't a whisper here. It was a thunderclap. You shouldn't be here. The current is too strong. Let go. It's easier if you let go. I'm not letting go, Henry. Sarah screamed into the void, her mental voice projecting with the force of her will. Where are you? Where is the center? The core? Henry's image flickered, his face cycling through the faces of a dozen other old men. The core is the silence. The core is where he is. Elias? He is the anchor, Henry wept. He holds the sky up. If he breaks, we all fall. Sarah understood. Elias Thorne wasn't just a battery. He was the central processor, the patient zero whose resilience allowed the network to exist. If she could reach him, if she could disrupt the anchor, the whole web would snap. She didn't swim. She willed herself forward. She tore through the layers of other people's nightmares, swimming upstream against the flow of data. She saw secrets, flashes of military codes, banking algorithms, encrypted political assassinations, all being crunched and decoded by the dormant brains of the forgotten. This was the product. This was the medicine. Back in the physical world, the reality was just as volatile. Head nurse Miller stood over Sarah's convulsing body, watching the monitors with a frown. Her heart rate is spiking to 180. She's fighting the integration. Increase the voltage on the dampeners. Vance ordered from the observation deck, his voice tinny through the intercom. She has a strong will. Break it. Miller reached for a dial on the console next to the chair. She twisted it. In the void, the sky turned red. Pain, pure and distilled, lashed across Sarah's mind like a whip. She screamed, her mental avatar fraying at the edges. Submit, the system commanded. Go to hell, Sarah snarled. She saw him then. In the center of the chaos, a pillar of calm blue light. Elias Thorne. He was floating in the digital space just as he floated in the tank. But here, he looked like a god. A weeping, broken god. He was holding thousands of threads of light, weaving them together, bearing the weight of every mind in Blackwood. Sarah flew to him. She grabbed his arm. The contact burned. Elias, she shouted. Let go. Elias opened his eyes. They were galaxies. I can't, he spoke, his voice vibrating through her. If I let go, they die. I am keeping them alive. You're keeping them enslaved. Sarah countered, gripping him tighter. Look at them. They aren't living. They're processing. You have to break the loop, Elias. You have to wake them up. It hurts, Elias whispered. I know, Sarah said, her voice softening. I know it hurts, but you have to scream. Don't process the pain. Scream it. She poured her own rage into him. She showed him the image of Vance crushing the camera. She showed him Henry being beaten. She showed him the faces of the 40 missing people. Elias looked at her. The blue light in his eyes flared white. Scream? He asked. Scream, Sarah commanded. Elias threw his head back, and he screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a data spike, a surge of raw, unadulterated bioelectric feedback. In the physical world, the bank of monitors behind Nurse Miller exploded. Glass showered the room. Miller screamed, shielding her face. The lights in the prep room blew out, plunging the room into darkness, illuminated only by the sparking ruins of the medical equipment. The electronic locks on Sarah's restraints short-circuited. Click, click, click. The leather straps loosened. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The blue void was gone, replaced by the smell of ozone and smoke. Her body felt like it had been run over by a train, but her mind was on fire with a clarity she had never known. The drug hadn't erased her. The surge had rebooted her. What did you do? Miller shrieked, stumbling back, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. She grabbed a scalpel from the tray. You little witch. Sarah didn't speak. She moved. She didn't feel the stiffness in her limbs. She lunged forward, not away from the danger, but directly at it. As Miller slashed with the scalpel, Sarah caught her wrist. The grip was iron. Sarah twisted, hearing the satisfying crunch of cartilage. Miller howled and dropped the blade. That was for Henry, Sarah whispered, her voice raspy, sounding like the static she had just escaped. She shoved Miller backward. The large woman stumbled over the debris of the exploded monitor and fell hard against the high-voltage panel. Sparks arced, and Miller convulsed, unconscious before she hit the floor. Sarah stood alone in the flickering room. She was shaking, her skin slick with sweat and the blue residue of the injection site. She needed to leave, but she didn't just need to escape. She had failed to record the evidence on the button camera. But she realized something else. When she was in the void, she hadn't just seen the data. She had become the data. She tapped her temple. It was all in there. The codes, the names, the dates. The drug had imprinted the network's secrets directly onto her temporal lobe. She was the hard drive now. She stumbled to the door. The electronic lock was dead. She pried it open with her fingers, ignoring the tearing of her nails. The hallway was a scene from the apocalypse. The scream Elias had released hadn't just blown out the prep room. It had surged through the entire facility. The containment locks on Ward C had failed. The patients were out. Sarah stepped into the corridor and stopped. Dozens of patients in gray uniforms were wandering the halls. But they weren't rioting in anger. They were waking up. The feedback loop had severed the control link. Men and women who had been catatonic for years were looking at their hands, touching the walls, weeping as their memories returned in a flood. "The doors," a woman whispered, staring at the exit sign. "The doors are open." Then the alarm started. A deafening, rhythmic klaxon that signaled a catastrophic breach. Code Black. All sectors. Containment failure. The loudspeakers blared. Sarah grabbed the arm of a passing patient, the man from bed 8. "Go," she rasped. "Run. Get them out. Go to the main gate. Overwhelm them." The man looked at her, clarity dawning in his eyes. He nodded. "Run," he shouted to the others. "Run." The hallway erupted into a stampede. The patients became a tide of gray, smashing into the confused orderlies who were trying to deploy riot shields. Sarah didn't run with them. She turned against the flow. She had one last thing to do. She needed a transmitter. The satellite dish on the roof was destroyed, but there was another way out. The head office. Vance's office. It had a hardline connection to the external DoD servers. She sprinted through the chaos, dodging gurneys and fighting staff. She moved with a terrifying precision. She picked up a fallen baton from an unconscious guard. She wasn't Jane Doe anymore. She was a weapon forged in the fire of the East Wing. She reached the administration block. The door to Vance's office was locked. She didn't pick it. She smashed the frosted glass with the baton and reached through, unlocking it from the inside. The office was lavish, smelling of mahogany and fear. Vance was there. He was frantically shoving hard drives into a shredder, sweat pouring down his pale face. He looked up as Sarah entered, his eyes widening behind his glasses. "You," he breathed. "That's impossible." The dosage was lethal. "I have a high tolerance," Sarah said, stepping over the broken glass. She locked the door behind her. Vance reached for a drawer, a gun. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw the baton. It spun through the air and struck Vance's hand with a sickening crack. He screamed, clutching his broken fingers, collapsing into his leather chair. Sarah crossed the room in 3 strides. She grabbed Vance by his lapels and hauled him up. "The terminal," she ordered. "Unlock it." "You can't." Vance spat, cradling his hand. "It's biometric. It requires a retinal scan and a voice print. You can't access the mainframe." "I don't need to access the mainframe," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "I am the mainframe." She shoved him aside and sat in his chair. She grabbed the USB cable connected to the secure server uplink. She looked at the cable. Then she looked at the open wound on her arm where the 4 had been ripped out during the struggle. It was a gamble, a biological impossibility. But the blue fire was still humming in her veins, and the voices were still whispering in the back of her head. She stripped the end of the USB cable, exposing the copper wires. She pressed the wires directly against the weeping puncture wound on her arm, right into the blue-stained vein. Pain, white and hot, blinded her. She screamed, arching her back. On the computer screen, a dialog box popped up. "External device detected. Analyzing. Error. Unknown format. Retrying." "Come on," Sarah thought, pushing her mind toward the machine. "Talk to it, Elias. Talk to it." She channeled the static. She pushed the raw data of the project, the stolen memories, the illegal trials, the faces of the dead, through her nervous system and into the copper wire. The screen flickered. Handshake complete. Uploading. Blackwood _archive dump. "My God." Vance whispered, staring at her in horror. "What are you?" "I'm the news." Sarah gritted out through clenched teeth. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Outside the office door, heavy boots thundered. The tactical team had arrived. Open the door, or we breach. Sarah ignored them. She stared at the bar. Bam! A battering ram hit the door. The wood splintered. Stop the upload. Vance screamed to the guards outside. Cut the power. Sarah looked at Vance. It's too late for that. The door hinges gave way. The tactical team poured into the room, rifles raised. Drop it. Step away from the computer. Sarah didn't move. She kept the wire pressed to her vein, her blood mixing with the data. Fire! The lead officer shouted. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah saw the muzzle flash. She felt the heat of the bullet before it arrived. Upload complete. Sent to the Daily Chronicle, FBI, Gov, New York Times, Gong, Api, Org. The bullet struck the monitor, exploding it into a shower of sparks and plastic. But the message was gone. It was in the cloud. It was everywhere. Sarah was thrown backward by the force of the explosion. She hit the floor hard, darkness encroaching on her vision. This time, it wasn't the blue void. It was the black, peaceful silence of unconsciousness. The last thing she heard was the sound of sirens. Not the asylum's alarms, but the distinct, wailing cry of police cruisers approaching from the valley below. Dozens of them. And underneath it all, a voice in her head, soft and fading. Thank you, Jane. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. The silence of the hospital room was different from the silence of Blackwood. It was clean. It smelled of lilies and antiseptic, not bleach and fear. Sarah opened her eyes. The light was soft, filtering through blinds that let in real sunshine. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, wrapped in bandages. Her left arm, the arm she had used to interface, was in a cast, throbbing with a dull ache. Easy now, a familiar voice said. Mark was sitting in the chair next to the bed. He looked exhausted, unshaven, but his eyes were shining. He put down a copy of the Daily Chronicle. The headline took up the entire front page, bold and black. The Blackwood Horror. State Asylum exposed as illicit mind control facility. You were out for 3 days, Mark said softly. We thought. Well, the doctors didn't know what to make of your blood work. They said your electrolyte levels were impossible, like you'd been struck by lightning. Sarah licked her dry lips. Did it work? Mark smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. Sarah, you didn't just break the story. You broke the government. The governor resigned this morning. The FBI raided Blackwood an hour after your signal hit. They found everything. The tanks, the files, Vance, and the patients. Sarah asked, the image of the gray tide haunting her. Most were recovered, Mark said. They're being transferred to real hospitals. Families are being notified. It's a mess, but it's a hopeful mess. And Henry? Sarah asked, bracing herself. Mark's expression softened. They found him in the East Wing. He was pretty bad, Sarah, but he's alive. He's in a trauma unit in Missoula. Sarah closed her eyes, letting out a breath she felt she had been holding for weeks. And Elias? Mark paused. He looked down at his hands. When the agents got to the main tank, it was empty. The glass was shattered from the inside. There was no body, just a lot of water and burnt wires. Sarah looked out the window. She remembered the voice. Thank you, Jane. He's gone, Sarah whispered. But he's free. Mark stood up and placed a hand on her shoulder. You're a hero, Sarah. But you're done. No more undercover. No more crazy stunts. You stay on the desk for a year. Deal? Sarah looked at him. She felt the lingering hum in the back of her mind. A faint static that would probably never go away. She touched the scar on her arm. Deal, she lied. 3 months later, the lakeside care facility was peaceful. The autumn leaves were turning gold, reflecting in the still water. Sarah pushed the wheelchair along the gravel path. Henry sat in it, a blanket over his knees. He looked frail, but the terror was gone from his eyes. He was watching a squirrel bury a nut. "It's going to be a cold winter," Henry said, his voice raspy but his own. "We have warm coats," Sarah said, adjusting his scarf. Henry turned to look at her. His memory was Swiss cheese, holes where the past used to be. But he remembered her. He always remembered her. "Did we win, Jane?" he asked. Sarah knelt down in front of him. She took his trembling hand in hers. "Yes, Henry, we won. And my name is Sarah." Henry smiled, his eyes wrinkling at the corners. "Sarah, it's a good name. Better than Jane." He looked back at the lake. "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" "The silence," Henry said blissfully. "No more static. Just the wind." Sarah listened. He was right. The voices were gone. The network was dead. But as she stood up and looked at her reflection in the lake, she saw a flash of blue in her own eyes. Just for a second. She pulled her coat tighter. The story was over. The tape was played. But the world was full of dark places, and she was the only one who could see in the dark. She turned the wheelchair back toward the house. "Come on, Henry," she said. "Let's go home." The return to consciousness was not a sudden gasp of air, but a slow, rhythmic drifting toward a distant shore. For a long time there was only the sound, a steady, metronomic beep. Beep, beep that cut through the darkness like a lighthouse beam in a fog. It was annoying, insistent, and undeniably tethered to the world of the living. Sarah Bennett opened her eyes. The light was aggressive, a brilliant, sterile white that stung her retinas. She tried to raise her hand to shield her face, but her arm refused to obey. It felt heavy, encased in something stiff and unyielding. She blinked, forcing her vision to focus. She wasn't in the green-tiled hell of the prep room. She wasn't in the blue void of the network. She was in a room that smelled of lilies, rubbing alcohol, and floor wax. "She's coming back," a voice said. It was a warm voice, rough around the edges but thick with relief. A face swam into view. Mark. He looked terrible. Eyes sunken with dark circles. A week's worth of gray stubble on his chin. His shirt rumpled as if he had slept in it for days. But to Sarah, he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He was reality. "Mark." Her voice was a ruin, a dry croak that scraped against her throat like sandpaper. "Easy, Tiger," Mark whispered, leaning over the rail of the hospital bed. He poured a cup of water with a straw and held it to her lips. "Drink. Don't talk. Just drink." The water was cold and clean. It washed away the phantom taste of copper and electricity that had been lingering in her mouth. She drank greedily until Mark pulled the cup away. "You've been out for 4 days, Sarah?" Mark said, sitting back in the plastic chair that had clearly become his permanent residence. The doctors were concerned. They'd never seen burn patterns like that on a living person's nervous system. They said your electrolyte levels were scrambled, like you'd been struck by lightning from the inside out. Sarah looked down at her left arm. It was heavily bandaged, immobilized in a sling. The memory hit her then. The office, the stripped wire, the blue fire of the connection. The scream. "The story," she rasped, struggling to sit up despite the protest of her bruised ribs. "Did it? Did the signal get out?" Mark let out a laugh, a short, sharp bark of incredulity. He reached down to the floor and picked up a stack of newspapers. He dropped them onto the blanket covering her legs. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Chronicle. The headlines screamed in bold, black ink. Blackwood horror. State asylum exposed as illicit military testing site the Mine Stealers. Project Monarch revealed in massive data dump, governor resigns amidst FBI raid on House of Horrors. "You didn't just get the signal out, Sarah," Mark said, his voice trembling with professional awe. "You flooded the world. Every major news outlet, every government watchdog, every encryption server in the Pentagon received the packet simultaneously. It was undeniable. The sheer volume of the data, the videos, the logs, the patient manifest. They couldn't bury it. They tried for about an hour, but it was like trying to hold back a tsunami with a paper shield." Sarah touched the paper, feeling the texture of the newsprint. It was real. It wasn't a hallucination induced by the blue fluid. Vance? She asked. In custody, Mark said, his expression darkening with satisfaction. The FBI tactical team found him in his office, trying to set fire to the hard copies. He's currently in a federal holding facility in D.C. And from what I hear, he's trying to cut a deal by giving up his superiors in the DOD. But the public outcry is too loud. They're gonna hang him out to dry. He's looking at life, Sarah. Multiple life sentences. And Miller? Intensive care under guard, Mark replied. They found her in the prep room. Whatever you did, the electrical surge, it fried the pacemakers of 3 guards and shorted out the entire security grid. Miller took a nasty shock, but she'll live long enough to stand trial. Sarah leaned back against the pillows, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a profound, crushing exhaustion. The victory was massive, monumental even, but her mind drifted past the headlines, past the villains to the victims. The patients, she whispered. Mark, tell me about the patients. Mark shifted in his chair, his demeanor softening. It was chaos, Sarah, but the good kind. When the power died, the magnetic locks on the wards failed. The drugs, the network connection, it broke. When the state troopers arrived, they didn't find a riot. They found people walking out of the gates. Men and women who hadn't spoken in years were sitting in the snow, crying, asking for their mothers, remembering their names. It's going to be a long road for them. The psychological damage is severe. But they are free. The Red Cross has set up a triage center in the town below. Families are coming in from all over the country. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the image wash over her. The gray tide flowing out of the fortress. The silence of the static finally broken. And Henry? She asked, the question hanging in the air, fragile as glass. Bed 13. Henry Gale. Mark paused. The silence stretched a second too long. Sarah opened her eyes, fear spiking in her chest. Mark? He's alive, Mark said quickly, reaching out to pat her uninjured hand. He's alive, Sarah. They found him in the East Wing. He was strapped to a gurney right next to the main processor tank. He had been prepped for the procedure. Did they? No. Mark shook his head. They didn't have time. The surge happened before they could insert the interface. But he was in shock. Severe hypothermia, dehydration, trauma. He's in a specialized trauma unit in Missoula. He's confused, Sarah. He drifts in and out. But he's safe. Sarah nodded, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. Safe. It was enough. For now. One more thing, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The tank. The central one. Elias Thorne. Mark stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. He seemed to be searching for the right words. That's the part the feds can't figure out, he said, keeping his back to her. When they secured the East Wing, the central tank, Subject Zero, was shattered. Not from the outside, but from the inside out. The glass was thick enough to stop a bullet, Sarah, but it was blown apart like confetti. Where is he? Gone. Mark turned around. There was no body, no footprints leading away, just a pool of that blue fluid and a mess of burnt-out cables. The official report says he must have been dissolved by the chemical mixture during the surge, or perhaps he escaped into the mountains and succumbed to the elements. They're still searching the woods with drones. Sarah looked at the scar on her arm, the point where she had connected herself to the machine. She remembered the voice in the void. I am the anchor. She remembered the moment he screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of release. They won't find him, Sarah said softly. Why do you say that? Because he didn't escape, Mark? She whispered, touching her temple. He ascended. Recovery was a slow, grueling season. The winter melted into a slushy, gray spring, mirroring Sarah's own rehabilitation. The physical wounds healed faster than the mental ones. Her arm regained its strength, leaving a jagged, starburst scar on her inner forearm that looked like a lightning strike. But the nights were hard. She would wake up sweating, hearing the static, feeling the phantom pressure of 1,000 voices pressing against her skull. She couldn't use a computer for a month. The hum of the hard drive made her nauseous. She couldn't look at blue LEDs without flinching. She became a recluse. She refused the talk shows. She turned down the book deals. She let Mark handle the Pulitzer Committee. She wasn't interested in being the face of the story. She had lived the story, and it had taken a piece of her that couldn't be replaced by awards. But she had a promise to keep. By late autumn, when the trees of Montana had turned to burning gold and russet, Sarah finally packed her bag. She bought an old pickup truck, something sturdy and analog, and drove west. The destination was a small, private care facility nestled on the edge of Flathead Lake. It was funded anonymously, the royalties from the exclusive rights to the Blackwood story, which Sarah had quietly funneled into a trust for the survivors. It wasn't an asylum. It was a home. Large windows, open lawns, no fences. She found him sitting on a bench near the water's edge. He looked different. The gaunt, skeletal hunger of Blackwood was gone, replaced by a healthy softness. He was wearing a thick cable-knit sweater and a flat cap. He was throwing pieces of bread to a group of mallards paddling in the chilly water. Sarah approached slowly, the gravel crunching softly under her boots. She didn't want to startle him. "The green one is greedy," the old man said without turning around. "He takes everything, but he doesn't share with the little brown ones." Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest for the first time in months. "There's always one greedy one, Henry." Henry Gale stopped throwing bread. His hand froze in mid-air. He turned his head slowly. His eyes were still the same, clear, intelligent, but now they held a softness, a dreamy quality, as if he were watching a movie that only he could see. He looked at Sarah. He looked at her jagged hair, now grown out into a messy bob. He looked at the scar on her arm, visible where her sleeve was rolled up. He didn't speak for a long time. The wind rustled the dry leaves around their feet. "I know you," Henry whispered. He squinted, tilting his head. "You're the girl from the dream." "It wasn't a dream, Henry," Sarah said, sitting down on the bench beside him, leaving a respectful distance. "It was a nightmare, but we woke up." Henry nodded slowly, absorbing this. He went back to tearing a piece of bread, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from age. "I forget things," Henry confessed, his voice sounding small against the vastness of the lake and the mountains beyond. "The doctors say my memory is full of holes, like a moth-eaten coat. I remember the war sometimes. I remember my wife singing, but there are big dark spots, years of dark spots." "That's okay," Sarah said gently. "You don't need to fill them in." "But I remember the angel," Henry said suddenly, turning to her with intensity. "In the dark place, with the blue lights, the angel came and broke the chains. She had a button that was an eye, and she told me to run." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a new button, a simple gray plastic button. She placed it in Henry's hand. "She didn't do it alone, Henry," Sarah said. "The angel needed a soldier to tell her where to go. She needed a friend." Henry looked at the button. He closed his fist around it, holding it tight like a talisman. A tear leaked from his eye, tracking through the deep lines of his face. "Sarah," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He remembered the name she had told him in the aftermath, or perhaps he remembered it from the cafeteria when she had whispered it to him in the dark. "Yes, Henry. I'm Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated, testing the weight of the word. He smiled, and it was a beatific expression, free of the shadow of Blackwood. "Thank you for coming back." "I'll always come back," she promised. They sat there for a long time as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of violet and fire. The air grew cold, biting at their cheeks. "It's getting late," Sarah said, standing up and offering him her hand. "We should get you inside." "Hot cocoa? With marshmallows?" Henry asked, taking her hand. His grip was frail but warm. "As many as you want." Sarah pushed his wheelchair. He still needed it for long distances. up the path toward the warm, glowing lights of the main house. As they reached the porch, Sarah stopped and looked back. The lake was perfectly still, a mirror reflecting the darkening sky. And for a fleeting second, in the reflection of the water, she didn't see the mountains or the trees. She saw a flicker of blue. Not the sickly neon blue of the tanks, but a deep celestial blue. A spark. She touched her temple. The static was gone. The voices were silent, but the connection remained. Somewhere out in the ether, in the spaces between the data streams, Elias was watching. The 40 lost souls were found. The monsters were in cages, and the truth was written in ink and blood for the world to read. Sarah Bennett took a deep breath of the clean, sharp mountain air. She wasn't Jane Doe anymore. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the witness, and she was ready for whatever story came next. She turned back to Henry, opened the door, and pushed him into the warmth and the light. "Welcome home, Henry," she said. The door clicked shut, sealing out the cold, leaving only the quiet peace of a promise kept.